Humbert here. Today we're going to be doing Unit 2, Learning Target 3. So we're going to be talking about graphing systems of inequalities. So a system of linear equalities is a set of two or more inequalities on the same graph. So the solution is the region where both of the inequalities are shaded. So if you'll notice that our shading on both of these lines overlaps at that point right there. That represents our solution for those two inequalities. And you don't have to worry about writing this down, just get these two in that first box there. So pause the video if you didn't quite get that written down. So let's go ahead and let's take a look at number 1 here. So let's think way back to Unit 1 when we shaded inequalities. Remember that if the alligator's facing away from the y, you're going to be shading down. So this first one, we're shading down, and actually for this second one, we're also shading down because they're both facing away from the y. Now remember, if there's a line underneath the inequality, the line is going to be solid. So this equation right here is going to have a solid line because the line is underneath that inequality symbol. However, on the first one, there is no line underneath, so that one is going to be dotted. Okay, so let's take a look at graphing number 1. So for number 1, you're crossing the y-axis at 1. So we're going to go ahead and plot that point. So then my slope for number 1 is -1, which really is the same as -1 over 1. So I'm going down 1, right 1, down 1, right 1. And that's going to be dotted. So I'm going to go ahead and draw a dotted line. Then we're going to shade beneath it. So what I like to do is just draw a little bit of spaced lines so that I know kind of where the shading is supposed to be. Now let's go ahead and graph the second line. So for the second line, we're crossing it at 3. And then my slope is 2, which really is the same as 2 over 1. So I'm going up 2 and over 1. So now I'm going to go ahead and connect that with a solid line. And from there, again, I'm shading down. So since I did the other ones vertical, I like to do horizontal stripes here. So do you see in this area right here, my two regions they crossed each other. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to shade it in really extra dark so that who's ever looking at it, meaning Ms. Humbert, can tell that this is the shaded region right there. So then you're done with number 1 once you can show me that shaded region. So taking a look at number 2, we have some decisions to make. So let's take a look at the first one here. So for the first one, the alligator is opening towards the y, so I know I'm shading up. I notice that there's no line underneath the inequality, so it's going to be dotted. Then taking a look at the second one, I notice that's facing away from the y, so I'm shading down. And then I notice that there's no line underneath, so it's going to be dotted. So let's go ahead and let's take a look at number 2. So we're crossing the y-axis at 1. And then there's going to be a 1 out in front of it. So that means that my slope is 1 over 1. So for my slope, I'm going up 1 over 1, up 1 over 1. And again, I'm going to be using a dashed or dotted line, like so. Since the alligator's facing away from the y, I'm going to shade up, above the line. Taking a look at that second line, I'm crossing the y-axis at a -3. And then my slope again is 1, which is the same as 1 over 1. So I'm going up 1 over 1, up 1 over 1. And again, that's going to have a dashed line. And then I'm going to shade beneath that line. So you notice how my shading never crossed? Just like if the lines never crossed before, we had no solution. So for this one, because our shading don't cross, there is no solution for number 2. Let's go ahead and let's take a look at number 3. So for number 3, I want to take a look. First of all, I notice that the alligator is facing towards the y on that first one. So I know my shading is going to be up. Then there's a line underneath the inequality, which means I'm going to draw a solid line. Okay? Then, taking a look at the shading on the second one, I notice that the alligator's facing away from the y, so I'm going to be shading down. Then I notice that there's a solid line underneath the y, or underneath the inequality, so I know I'm going to have a solid line. So let's go ahead and let's take a look at graphing these. So for this one, we're crossing the y-axis at a -6, and that's down here. Well, my slope is 3. That's really the same as 3 over 1. So I'm going up 1, 2, 3, and over 1. Now I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to connect that with a solid line. Okay, then I know I need to shade up from that line, so I'm just going to lightly shade because I need to see where it's going to cross the other line. If it helps you to use two colors, use two colors. Oops, wrong one. I'm going to do that just to make it easier. So then for the second one, I'm crossing the y-axis at 4. And then my slope is -2. Well, remember, since it's not a fraction, it's the same as -2 over 1. So I'm going down 2, right 1, down 2, right 1. And again, I'm going to have a solid line here. And from there, I'm going to go ahead and shade down from the line. If you're having problems figuring out when to shade up and when to shade down, please come talk to me and I'd be happy to work on that together. So I noticed that my two colors crossed in this region right here. So I'm going to shade this in really, really dark so that who's ever looking at this knows that this right here represents that shaded region. Let's go ahead and take a look at number 4. So for number 4, I notice that the alligator is facing away from the Y, so I need to shade down. The line, or there's a line underneath the inequalities, so my line is going to be solid. Taking a look at the second equation, I see that the alligator is facing the Y, so I'm going to shade up. And I notice that there's no line underneath it, so it's going to be dotted. So let's go ahead and let's graph the first one. So for the first one, we're crossing the y-axis at 3. And then there's a 1 out in front of the x, which again is the same as 1 over 1. So I'm going up 1, over 1, up 1, over 1. And then I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to graph a solid line. And then I'm shading down. So I'm going to go underneath the line for when I'm shading down. Let's go ahead and let's take a look at the other line. So for the other line, we're crossing the y-axis at 2. And then our slope, since there's no coefficient, is a -1, which means I'm going down 1, right 1, down 1, right 1. And that one is going to be dotted. Then from there, I'm going to shade above the line. So I notice that the region that it crosses is right here. So I'm going to shade that one in extra dark so I know that that's the region that it's crossing in. Okay? All right, let's take a look now at number 5. So for number 5, I noticed that my alligator's opening towards the Y, so I need to shade up. Then I notice that there's no solid line underneath, so my line is going to be dotted. Then for the second one, I notice that it's facing towards the Y, so I'm going to shade up. And then there's no line underneath, so that line is also going to be dotted. So let's go ahead and let's plot this. So my y-intercept of the first one is -2. So we're crossing the y-axis at -2. My slope is 3, which means I'm going up 1, 2, 3, and over 1. So then what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and draw a dashed line through that. Then, since the alligator is opening towards the Y, I decided that I was going to shade up for number 5. Now let's take a look at the second one on number 5. So for the second one, I'm crossing the y-axis at 4 because that's what's being added on. Then my slope is -1, which is the same as down 1, right 1. Down 1, right 1. And that's going to also be dotted. And again, I'm going to shade up from the line. So I noticed that my two lines intersected here. That's where the two shadings cross. So I'm going to shade that in extra dark to show that that's the shaded region. Let's take a look at number 6. So for number 6, we're crossing the y-axis at 2, but we're not going to graph it quite yet. I'm getting ahead of myself. I noticed that the alligator is facing away from the Y, so I'm going to be shading down. And then there's no line underneath, so it's going to be dotted. Then for the next one, I noticed that's opening towards the Y, so I'm going to shade up, and there is a line underneath, so my line is going to be solid. So let's go ahead and take a look at this one. So for the first one, we're crossing the y-axis at 2. Then I see that my slope is 2x. Now that's the same as 2 over 1. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go up 2 over 1. Now that's going to have a dotted line, and I am going to shade down from that dotted line. Taking a look at this next one, I'm crossing the y-axis at -3, which is right here. Then my slope is -1 or -1 over 1. So I'm going to go ahead and work my way down, and that line is going to be solid. Now I decided that I'm shading up from that line, so I'm going to go ahead and shade that in. Now I notice that it's crossing in this region right here. So that right there is my solution for number 6. Now, number 7 can be kind of confusing, okay? Because we have the just x and the just y. Well, remember that if it's just x, that it is a vertical line, okay? So then, if it's vertical, I want to look at the x-axis. And since the alligator is facing towards the x, I want it to get bigger. So I notice that x gets bigger as it goes to the left. So instead of writing up or down, I'm actually going to write that I'm shading to the left because that's where x is getting bigger. There's no solid line underneath the inequality, so my line is going to be dotted. Now taking a look at this one, now remember that if it's just a y, it's horizontal, and I'm going to run out of room to write that word. It's horizontal. Okay, so my shading, since it's facing away from the y, is going to be down, which makes sense because that's the way that y is getting smaller, is going down. And the line again is also going to be dotted. So let's go ahead and let's graph those two lines. Okay, so first is at the x, the vertical one. So I find where x is equal to 3 on the x-axis. Then I'm going to go ahead and draw a vertical line through that point that's dashed. And remember, I want to shade it to the left because that's where x is getting bigger. Now I want to find -2 on the y-axis. So I'm going to find -2 on the y-axis, which is right here. And then I'm going to have a horizontal line through that one. Now for that one, I'm shading down. And so I notice that the two cross in this region right here, so I'm going to go ahead and make that one darker. Now, let's take a look at number 8. Same thing. So since I have just an x, it's going to be vertical. Now I want x to be getting smaller. So if here's 4, it's getting smaller going to the left. So I'm going to be shading to the left. And my line is going to be dotted for this one because there's no line underneath the inequality. Taking a look at the second one, the alligator's facing away from the y, so I'm shading down, and there is a solid line underneath, so my line is going to be solid. So let's go ahead and let's take a look at number 8. So we're crossing the x-axis. I want to find 4. So here's 4 on the x-axis. I'm going to draw a dashed vertical line through 4. And it's getting, and I want to shade to the left. So I'm going to go ahead and shade to the left. Then y is less than or equal to -6. I keep hitting that one. So then what we're going to do is find the 6, which is right here on the y-axis, and I'm going to have a solid horizontal line through there. And I need to shade down from that line. So the region that I cross is this whole region right here. So I'm going to make sure I shade that in really, really dark so that the person who's looking at it knows the answer. So that concludes your note video for today. Thank you for listening.